Hello, and welcome back to the secret bonus segment of the Explaining History podcast. Lovely to share this space with you as always. Today we'll answer the question of the day as submitted by you. Kiara, age 19 from Oxford, has today's inquiry. She writes, "Hello, Explaining History crew. A couple of days ago, I was doom scrolling on TikTok and found an interesting video on Gandhi. Interesting in that it was completely negative. There are mentions of odd abstinence experiments with his family, equally troubling views towards women, black South Africans, prejudiced views on caste. It all caught me by surprise. Coming from an Indian household," Kiara states, "these views were far removed from my perception and understanding of Gandhi to an almost comical level. How have I never come across critiques of him? I think back on movies I've watched and relatives always speaking fondly about him back home in India. Gandhi acted as a figure of peace in my brain, one that was closely tied with India's modernity. I'm new to engaging with history. How do I grapple with the negativity of a figure that seems so interlinked with how I envision my identity? It may seem trivial, but where do I go from here?" So, Kiara, for starters, your point is far from trivial. I think what you're experiencing is fundamentally the culmination of questions that historians grapple with every day. I mean, ideas of how and why historical narratives change, how are we exposed to new information, what role does our perception of identity have on how we view historical events and figures? How do we grapple with figures that are products of their time in a contemporary landscape of changing moral standards and ideals? We ask ourselves, how do we remember and give adequate justice to historical figures who were once nuanced, complex human beings like the rest of us? Now, all of these don't have a clear answer, but as critical thinkers like yourself, Kiara, we should strive to keep questioning, interrogating, and then questioning again. There's a strongly misheld misconception that history forms a stagnant practice, in that it's set in a past that can never change. But your excellent question reminds us that historical interpretations are dynamic and actually change with the course of time. Now, in the interest of time, let's pick out some points and valid questions that you raise. For one, I think it's fascinating that TikTok facilitated your exposure to views that actually fall in line with a lot of modern historiographical critiques on Gandhi. Your story exemplifies a wider social trend of online media guiding how we are exposed to history. This fundamentally changes the game. I mean, your mention of movies speaks to the previous ways we were exposed to historical findings. I'm confident in assuming that you watched Richard Attenborough's 1982 film Gandhi, this dramatic portrayal of good triumphing over evil, spearheaded by a pacifist leader that revolutionizes how we perceive and understand nonviolence. The movie is often the first point of entry for people understanding Gandhi, and why wouldn't it be? I mean, it's a fairly accurate historic representation, obviously barring its hyperboles, and it offers a digestible starting point to what is a complex history of Indian independence. But your question, Kiara, is made even more interesting with your mention of Gandhi's remembrance back home in India. I mean, it isn't controversial to assume that his portrayal is different in the UK or Japan or Nigeria. I mean, each country operates with its own unique blend of historical memory and cultural attitudes. And these guide the types of historical output we're exposed to and the prevalence of them. In India's example, there are national sort of museums. There's a National Gandhi Museum in Delhi. There are heritage points, places that he lived in, impacted, theater shows even. India remembers the figure as a pioneer of decolonization and Indian peace. Obviously this varies like all other interpretations, but it's largely the case today. And it's necessary then to understand that your relatives perhaps lived through these portrayals, heard about historical interpretation throughout their lives, and today they hold these viewpoints that largely reflect the output they were exposed to. Without extrapolating on your life, Kiara, it seems that you have ties to the UK. This could be a potential source of difference in the media you're exposed to, much like your relatives back home. We now live in an age where social media facilitates an infinite number of opinions and narratives. Your doom scrolling on that fateful day led you down an avenue that made you rethink how you understand and perceive the past and its present day ramifications. You mentioned that you're not much of a historian, but you're actually employing all the tools of one. If you were to get technical, your mention of criticisms fall in line with the works of Perry Anderson in 2012, for example, who emphasized Gandhi's persistent conservatism. Perhaps these go on to explain the alleged racism towards South Africans and Gandhi's potentially sexist views. The historical landscape of the 2000s has fallen in line with much of Anderson's critiques today. We today operate in a landscape that is much more conscious of bias and prejudice and discrimination, and these values guide how we interpret the past. They may also suggest why your relatives hold opinions that may be representative of the era they grew up in, or the sort of intellectual climate of the youth. Perhaps it reflects when they were most inquisitive about the world and its surroundings. Expectedly, Gandhi is tied to how you view your Indian heritage and identity. Whilst this may be troubling when you understand that the figure is flawed and imperfect, like all other figures, it should feel liberating knowing, that you have the opportunity to expose yourself to varied viewpoints and build a critical perspective on your own. One that is grounded with facts, but guided by your values. Perhaps it's time to explore his collected works, for example. We're out of time, Kiara, but I thank you for your thoughtful question on historical legacy. It certainly made me very existential. Have a good one.